A new home should mean a fresh start, but what if the house has other plans? Some houses don't want new owners. Some houses never let go. I've noticed the channel losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways to support me. It's quick, free, and ensures you keep getting awesome content. Your support means everything. Thank you so much. I didn't believe in ghosts before we moved into that house. I used to laugh at people who said they heard voices or saw things in the dark. I told myself they just had overactive imaginations, or they were looking for attention. Even when my wife told me she had a bad feeling about the place, I brushed it off. It's just an old house, I told her. Creaky floors, bad wiring. That's all. I should have listened to her. We bought the house in late 2019. It was a 2-story Victorian, a little rundown but nothing that couldn't be fixed. The owner was an old man who barely spoke during the sale. When I asked why he was leaving, he just shook his head and said, "I've been here too long." That stuck with me. The first time something felt off was the night we moved in. We were unpacking boxes, exhausted but excited. My wife was in the kitchen setting up while I was in the living room. At some point, I heard her call my name from the hallway. "Babe," she said. It sounded weird. Off. Like someone trying to mimic her voice but not quite getting it right. I walked into the hallway. She wasn't there. "Yeah." I called out. Silence. Then she answered, from the kitchen. "What?" My blood ran cold. "I thought you called me," I said, forcing myself to laugh. She frowned. "No, I didn't." I didn't say anything after that. I told myself I had imagined it. Over the next few weeks, little things kept happening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was standing next to the bed. The dog, who had always been friendly, would refuse to go into certain rooms, standing at the threshold and growling at nothing. Sometimes, I'd hear soft knocking coming from inside the walls. But the worst part was the door. There was a door in the basement that led to a small, unfinished storage room. The first time I saw it, I hated it. I don't know why. It was just a normal door, plain, wooden, with an old iron handle, but something about it made my stomach turn. The first time I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. "Honey," my wife called from the top of the basement stairs, "what are you doing?" "Trying to open this door," I said. She hesitated. "What door?" I turned to look at her. "The one right." I stopped. The door was gone. I stared at the empty wall, my heart hammering. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. I just swallowed hard and went upstairs like nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the door. I heard the knocking. I kept thinking about how, when I had touched the handle, it had felt warm. Like someone had just been on the other side. Things escalated quickly after that. My wife started waking up with bruises on her arms, small, dark fingerprints that she swore weren't there the night before. I'd find cabinets open that I knew I had closed. We started hearing voices at night, faint whispers, just on the edge of understanding. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the feeling of something breathing against my neck. The air was ice cold. I shot up, gasping, and looked around. The room was empty, but the closet door, which we always kept closed, was wide open. I didn't go back to sleep that night. A few days later, my wife was in the shower when she screamed. I ran to the bathroom and found her standing there, soaking wet, shaking. "What happened?" I asked, grabbing a towel and wrapping it around her. She didn't speak at first. She just pointed at the mirror. "Get out." The words were written in the steam, dripping slowly down the glass. That was it for me. We packed our things that night and left. We didn't sell the house. We didn't even try. We just left it, abandoned, like something out of a horror movie. A few months later, I got a call from an unknown number. I answered. At first, there was just silence. Then, in a low, distorted voice, someone whispered, "Come back." I hung up. We never spoke about the house again. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up and feel like something is standing in the corner of the room. Waiting. When my wife and I bought the house, it felt like a dream come true. It was one of those places that looked like it belonged on a postcard. Big front porch, tall oak trees, a long gravel driveway that crunched under your feet. It sat on about 2 acres of land, just far enough from the city to feel peaceful but close enough that we weren't completely isolated. The house had been built in the early 80s and had only had one owner before us. The seller was an older woman, probably in her late 70s, who seemed eager to move. She didn't say much during the walkthrough, only that she'd lived there with her husband for nearly 40 years. We should have known something was off when she handed us the keys. She hesitated, fingers wrapped tight around them, and then said, "Sometimes it doesn't like change." I laughed awkwardly, thinking she was just being sentimental about leaving a place she'd spent most of her life in. My wife smiled and reassured her we'd take good care of the house. The woman nodded but didn't smile back. She just muttered something under her breath and walked away. The first few weeks were normal. We spent most of our time painting, unpacking, and making the house feel like ours. There were a few small things, like the way the front door would swing open by itself, even when it was latched, or how the lights in the upstairs hallway flickered at random, but old houses had their quirks. Then, about a month in, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the hardwood floor downstairs. My first thought was that someone had broken in. My wife was still asleep beside me, breathing softly. I reached for the baseball bat I kept under the bed and crept down the hall. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the porch light spilling in through the windows. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel it, that awful, prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I flipped on the light in the living room. Nothing. The doors were all locked, windows shut tight. I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe I'd been dreaming and the sound had carried over into my half-awake state. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, the footsteps didn't stop. They moved slowly, deliberately, from the kitchen to the staircase. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, gripping my wife's arm. She heard it too. "Did you lock the doors?" she whispered. I nodded. We both listened as the steps came closer, up the stairs. Step. 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 Then they stopped. Right outside our bedroom door. I was frozen. My hand tightened around the bat, but I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Then, after what felt like hours but was probably only a few seconds, the footsteps started again, only this time, they were moving away. Down the hall. Toward the guest room. The next morning, I checked every inch of the house. There was no sign of a break-in. No muddy footprints. No open windows. Nothing. Things got worse after that. My wife started waking up with scratches on her arms. At first, we thought maybe she had done it in her sleep, but the marks were too clean, too deliberate. 3 parallel lines, thin and deep enough to sting but not bleed. Then there was the whispering. It started softly, just a faint sound we could almost convince ourselves was the wind. But soon, it became unmistakable, low, murmured voices coming from empty rooms. Sometimes I'd hear my wife calling my name, only to find her in a different part of the house, completely unaware she'd said anything. One night, I was in the basement fixing a leaky pipe when I heard her voice right behind me. "Hey," she said softly. I turned around, smiling, until I saw her standing at the top of the stairs. "Did you just say something?" I asked, my throat dry. She shook her head. I didn't tell her what I heard. I just put down my tools and walked upstairs as fast as I could. The breaking point came a few weeks later. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, when I woke up to a horrible, gut-wrenching smell. It was like rotting meat left out in the sun. My wife stirred beside me, her nose scrunching. "What is that?" she mumbled. I didn't answer. I was already getting out of bed, my pulse hammering in my ears. The smell was strongest in the hallway. I gagged, pulling my shirt over my nose as I moved toward the guest room. Something in me knew that the smell was coming from there. The door was shut. But I could hear something behind it. A faint, wet sound, like something dragging across the floor. My stomach twisted. I reached for the knob, my fingers trembling. Slowly, I turned it and pushed the door open. The room was empty. But the smell, God, the smell was overpowering. And then I saw it. The closet door was open. I knew we had shut it. My wife and I had gone into that room maybe twice since moving in, and we had both made sure to close the closet door because it wouldn't stay open, it always creaked shut on its own. But now, it was wide open. And inside, scratched into the back wall, was one word. Mine. That was the last night we spent in that house. We packed our bags before the sun even came up, tossing everything we could into our car. My wife didn't argue. She just kept looking back at the house, like she expected something to be watching from the windows. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. And for just a split second, I saw something standing on the porch. Tall. Dark. Waiting. We never went back. We let the bank take the house. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about anything except getting as far away as possible. Sometimes, I dream about it. About the whispering. About the thing in the guest room. And every time, I wake up with the feeling that something is still watching. We bought the house in December, right before the first real snowstorm of the season. It was perfect, an old farmhouse with a wraparound porch, sitting on 5 acres of land. The kind of place you'd imagine raising kids, growing old. We got it for a steal. The previous owners had left suddenly, no explanation. The realtor told us they had moved out of state, but something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me. My wife, Emily, fell in love with it instantly. She was already talking about renovations before we even had the keys. I wasn't as sure. The house felt heavy. I don't know how else to describe it. Like the air was thicker inside than it should have been. But I didn't want to ruin the moment. We moved in just after Christmas. The first few weeks were normal, busy, exciting. We spent most of our time unpacking, making the place feel like ours. Nothing felt out of the ordinary, except for one thing. The upstairs room at the end of the hall. It had been a nursery once, based on the faded blue wallpaper and the small rocking chair left behind in the corner. The door was always open when we walked by, but neither of us ever really went inside. There was no reason to. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of something creaking. At first, I thought it was the wind. The house was old, and old houses made noises. But then I heard it again. A slow, rhythmic creak coming from upstairs. The rocking chair. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It was faint, but I could hear it, steady back and forth of wood against wood. I glanced over at Emily, she was still fast asleep. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the house had shifted. Maybe I had imagined it. But in the morning, when I walked past the nursery, the chair was still moving. It was slow, barely noticeable, but it was rocking. Emily brushed it off. "You probably bumped the floor walking past," she said. "Or maybe there's a draft." I didn't argue. What else could I say? That the chair had been moving on its own. That I had spent half the night awake, listening to it. I let it go. Until the following week. We were in the kitchen making dinner when we heard it, loud footsteps upstairs, like someone walking back and forth. We froze, staring at each other. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered. I nodded. The footsteps stopped. The house went dead silent. I grabbed the fireplace poker from the hearth and slowly made my way upstairs. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. The nursery door was closed. I didn't remember closing it. I reached for the knob and hesitated. My gut was screaming at me to leave it alone, but I forced myself to turn it. The door creaked open, and nothing. The room was empty. The chair was still. But the air was cold. Colder than it should have been. My breath came out in small, white puffs. I backed out and shut the door. That night, Emily woke up screaming. She sat up so fast she nearly fell out of bed, clutching her chest, gasping for air. What happened? I grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently. She stared at me, wide-eyed, her whole body trembling. There was someone in the room, she whispered. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. A man, she said, her voice barely audible. Standing in the corner. Just staring at me. I turned on every light in the bedroom. Checked the closet, under the bed, even the hallway. Nothing. Emily didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Neither did I. The next day, she insisted on leaving the house for a while. I agreed. We spent most of the afternoon in town, avoiding talking about it, pretending like nothing had happened. When we finally came home, I was the first one inside. And I stopped dead in my tracks. Every single cabinet in the kitchen was open. Every drawer. Every cupboard. Like someone had torn through them, looking for something. Emily stepped in behind me and gasped. What the hell? I moved quickly, slamming them shut one by one, trying to control the rising panic in my chest. Maybe it was the wind, I said. Or maybe we left a window open. Emily shook her head. You know we didn't. She was right. All the windows were locked. That night, we slept with the lights on. It didn't help. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the nursery door slammed shut. I jumped out of bed, my pulse pounding in my ears. Emily clutched my arm, eyes wide with terror. Then we heard it. A low whispering sound, muffled, like someone talking through a wall. It was coming from the nursery. I didn't want to go. Every part of me was screaming, stay in bed, don't move, don't listen. But I had to. I grabbed the poker again and crept toward the hallway. The door was still shut, but I could hear something on the other side. Tap. 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 Like fingers drumming against wood. I reached for the handle and... silence. The tapping stopped. The whispering stopped. I held my breath and pushed the door open. The rocking chair was moving. And standing behind it, in the farthest corner of the room, a shape. I couldn't see it fully, just the suggestion of something tall and wrong in the dim light. A shadow darker than the rest of the room. I slammed the door shut so hard the walls shook. That was the last night we spent in the house. We left the next morning, taking only what we could fit in the car. I don't know what was in that house. I don't want to know. A few months later, I got a call from a local historian. I had left a few messages before we moved, trying to find out more about the house. He told me the property had belonged to a man named Charles Holloway back in the early 1900s. Holloway had been a doctor. A bad one. The kind who did things to his patients no one wanted to talk about. The town eventually ran him out, but before he left, he had locked one of his patients in a room upstairs. A little boy. They never found him. We don't talk about the house anymore. We don't say its name. We don't even drive past it. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. That slow, steady creaking of the rocking chair. Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing.